I had a very frank conversation with one of the reporters, and I said to him, why did you feel it necessary to call me the lesbian? You don't say the heterosexual premier now, And he said, we thought that where we came to was, you being a lesbian might color the way you see the world or, influence your decisions. And I said, so being a straight white man doesn't color and doesn't influence your decisions? I mean, it was nuts, but it was honest. That's how they saw it. Like, this was because I was a departure from the dominant norm. Yeah. Then somehow that had to be flagged for people.
Much has been written in journals, papers, and books by a significant group of academics and authors about feminism and the equality movement. And there's a growing inventory of productions about women in Canadian life. We want to add more. The Women's History Project is a nonprofit organization launched in 2022. Our ambition is to promote and showcase women in Canadian history. We want trailblazers, leaders, authors, and historians to tell stories about women in the labor movement, at work, in the media, women who took to the streets, equal pay, maternity benefit, the right to have your own bank account. We want to get women who are still living to recount their challenges and campaign. History is rich with stories about advocates, activists, and women in public life at the community, provincial, and national levels, across Canada, in small towns, on farms, in urban areas, women who have used their voice to make a difference. This is 1,000 Voices, 1,000 Stories. Kathleen Wynne, community activist, changemaker, politician. Born in 1953 in Richmond Hill, Kathleen Wynne has had a stellar career in public service. She earned a BA at Queen's University, Master of Arts degree in linguistics from the University of Toronto, and a Master of Education degree from the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education. In 1996, Kathleen helped found Citizens for Local Democracy to oppose the amalgamation of Metropolitan Toronto, which was being undertaken by the Progressive Conservative provincial government of the time. She also founded the Metro Parent Network intended to support improvements in the provincial education system. Kathleen was elected to public office as a trustee for the Toronto District School Board in 2000. She helped to pass a measure in 2001 to encourage public schools to purchase teaching materials to reflect the presence of gay and lesbian parents in society. She was then elected to the Ontario Legislature in 2003 for Don Valley West and served as Minister of Education, Minister of Aboriginal Affairs, Minister of Agriculture and Food, Transport and Housing under Premier Dalton McGuinty. She ran for and won the Liberal leadership in 2012 when Premier McGuinty resigned from office. Kathleen was sworn in as Premier of Ontario after winning the election in 2013, becoming Ontario's first woman Premier and the first openly LGBTQ+ Premier in Canada. Under her leadership, there were important changes in Ontario: increased minimum wage to $14 an hour, investment into youth job strategy to tackle youth unemployment, increased investment in home care health services for seniors, and increased the Ontario Child Benefit to support low-income families. In 2018, the Ontario Liberal Party suffered significant election loss, and Kathleen resigned as a result. Kathleen remains active in discussions on politics and advocacy today. She occasionally shares her insights on podcasts and in interviews. This afternoon, we're talking to Kathleen Wynne, school board trustee, member of the Ontario Provincial Legislature, at various times Minister of Education, Aboriginal Affairs, Transport's near and dear to my heart, and Housing, and the 25th Premier of Ontario. Thank you for joining us.
Happy to be here. Thanks, Debra.
Let's start at the beginning. Can you describe your early years and those points that helped create Kathleen Wynne, the activist and advocate for social justice and politician?
Well, if I go back really early, I'm the eldest of 4 girls. And so everything was possible for girls in our family, because we weren't competing with boys. And I had a grandmother who had been orphaned pretty much when she was 3, and a mother who had been orphaned when she was 10. So I had this experience of knowing women who had made their way in the world. My grandmother had been a teacher at the turn of the century, then the last century, 1899 to 1900. And then my mother had been a performer. She'd been a singer and an actor in Ontario. So I grew up thinking that I could do whatever I wanted to do. There wasn't anything holding me back. So I think that's one thing. The second thing is, I think that particularly my mom, who was a bit of a rabble rouser, she hadn't grown up in Canada. She'd grown up in the islands in Nassau and been sent up here to school after her parents died. And her father had been a black sheep from Ireland. So she was a rebel. She was very acutely aware of injustice. She'd lived in a segregated society, black and white, in Nassau, and her father had a different perspective on that. And so she was very intolerant of injustice and inequity. And so we grew up thinking that it was our job to fight for what was right. And she would go to town council on issues. And she, during the 60s, she worked with my dad, and they set up a youth aid. It was called the Youth Aid Center. It was like a youth drop-in center for kids who were booted out of their homes or whatever. So the second thing was, I believed that if something was missing, you had to make it. You had to create it. So I think that was what really formed me early on, and not taking no for an answer, which certainly my mom never did. That led to, in grade 9, I led a group of girls who protested not being able to wear pants to school, 1966, and we couldn't wear pants to school, and we got sent home from school, and we came back with notes from our moms, and, so early a sense of, if something's wrong, we got to try to fix it, and it's up to us. It's up to us to do it.
I always thought I could do, I grew up very similarly. You just sort of course, you want a smoking room in school? You protested until you got a smoking room in school.
Well, that's right. That was another thing that we dealt with. I never smoked, but getting a smoking room, having a teacher-student liaison committee, where we got to voice our opinions. I mean, it was the 60s, and it was our job to change the world, right?
I talked to Judy Rebick yesterday.
There you go. There you go.
There's somebody who's trying to change the world in the 60s.
Yeah, exactly. Well, on that, just final thing on that, when I was in high school, one of the things I did was I lived in Richmond Hill, so it was quite separate from Toronto in those days. And I organized for what we called a women's liber to come up from Toronto and speak to us. I don't know if it was somebody from the Velvet Fist or somebody, somebody who was active in the women's liberation movement, and came into the auditorium, and we set it up, and there was a lot of heckling from both young women and young men in the balcony against us. We were radical, and so that was my sort of first introduction to political protest against me. I hadn't experienced that. So yeah, they were tumultuous years. I was in high school from 66 to 71.
Yeah, and I was 68 to 72. So yeah, so it's really, so we had the same kind of experience. Yeah, those were fun years. Not. Would you describe yourself as a feminist?
Absolutely. It was always a big fight with my mom. She didn't call herself a feminist, but she was. She was strongly supportive of women being treated equally. So was my dad, actually. Even though some of his behaviors were not what you'd want, because he was born in 1926, and he was a product of his upbringing as well. But for sure, I would describe myself as a feminist. Absolutely.
I never did until somebody accused me of being, but I always was. Mm-hmm. So I always knew that women could do anything. I never thought that I never thought that we weren't equal. Mm-hmm. I always thought we were equal. I never thought about it until somebody accused me of being a feminist, and I just thought, oh. Anyway, I went back the next day and corrected him, said absolutely. So I only vaguely remember some of the campaigns in the 60s and in the early 70s, and I was focused on a few other things. But when did you recognize there were real barriers and challenges for women? Like, at what point? It wouldn't have necessarily been in high school. But...
No. I don't know if I've ever accepted that for myself. Like I believe that early on, I saw that there were barriers for women because of those social norms that I was talking about. I saw, even though I just said my dad was a strong believer in women doing what they everything they could. He was pretty patronizing to my mom, and he didn't really behave as though we, his 4 girls, were on the same track as the boys in our lives, So I think early on I knew it was going to be a fight, and certainly when I went, I started at school. I didn't like being excluded from things, and I remember feeling like we were excluded, and always feeling I was in sports, so always feeling like the girls' teams were very much second class, and I got myself into big trouble. I think it was in grade 11 because we had a really bad football team. The boys' team they lost every game, and we had a really good girls' volleyball team. And I remember doing an announcement and saying, if you want to see a team win, come to the volleyball game today because we're actually winning. We have a chance of winning. And I just got such blowback. People were so angry, and it was a stupid thing to say, but it was. I was angry. I felt angry at the way we were treated. So I think I knew early on that there were barriers to. I wasn't thinking about politics, but women doing the things that they wanted to do.
Well, in sport, but you raise the issue of sport, and there's just huge inequalities inequalities in sport.
Well, you should have seen our uniforms compared to the boys' uniforms. We were wearing those ridiculous bloomers, and there was no money. There was no money for equipment for the girls' teams, right?
I never took phys ed.
Oh, okay.
Wear the bloomers.
Yeah. Yeah, well, we had to, and I loved it, and sports was really, I was on all the teams. Our high school was only 500 kids, and sports was really important to me, and I know that it contributed to my sense of being able to be successful. I know it did.
I told one of my daughters, I said, I don't care what you take in school, as long as you do a lot of after-school activities.
Yeah.
That's what's going to actually create the personality and the woman that you're going to become.
Yeah.
And I started off in communications in high school, organizing dances and organizing everything and doing all of the publicity for everything. And actually that ended up being my career,
right.
Organizing and publicity.
Yeah.
So what you do in high school, and if young girls are listening, what you do in high school really can help shape.
Absolutely.
That team spirit.
Yeah.
And when you got into politics, it really is a team sport.
Well, when we did when we were in government, and Michael Coteau was our Minister of Tourism and Sport, and he did a paper on women in sports, and one of the stats that has stuck with me was 94% of women CEOs report having been involved in competitive sport at some point. So,
wow.
It doesn't surprise me at all. I don't know if that stat applies across all of North America, but it really doesn't surprise me at all, because there aren't that many places where early on we have our own area to compete in, and we're told to push ourselves, to really push ourselves, and it doesn't matter what you look like, and it doesn't matter whether you've got your hair done and makeup. It's more important what you can do with your body. That's a rare thing for young women.
But they also say too that single-sex schools, so girls' schools, girls do better, and it's only when girls are in mixed company that sometimes they fall a little bit behind. When in fact. They're
that's a whole debate. Yeah, that's an ongoing debate, but I do think single-sex environments for girls are better than single-sex environments for boys often, because boys get a lot of reinforcement. And I mean, obviously that's a debate in the education sector and has been for decades, and private schools in this province for sure have historically been single sex, right? And it's interesting to me that the girls' schools have not all gone co-ed, where most of the boys' schools have gone co-ed. The majority of boys' schools in the private sector have gone co-ed.
I do remember when my children were at school, and the prize giving at the end of the year, and it really struck me one year that most of the prizes were being won by the girls.
That is, yeah, and
the boys were
absolutely.
getting prizes in music, but the girls were getting their prizes in math.
Yeah, and it's shifted. It's shifted for sure.
Yeah.
But we still have a lot of work to do in terms of young girls believing they can do anything.
I just want to move on a little bit. The equality movement's also exacerbated by income, sexuality, and race. When you were at the school board or even in your private life, was that reinforced or were any of those views dispelled? The equality.
So the intersection, yeah, the intersection for sure. I mean, I was one of the trustees when I was on the board that wanted to start gathering race-based data, and it was early. You know, that was before we were talking about it even provincially. So. I was very aware. I represented a ward that was quite diverse socioeconomically and ethnically and socially, and so I was very aware that kids who lived in one part of the ward were. They were at a serious disadvantage. Yes, it was poverty, but it was also racism that was keeping them where they were, and was making it difficult for their parents to advance. So I think that it's quite clear that women of color, women LGBTQ, women living in poverty, all of those disabilities, all of those things are increased barriers for women, for sure.
Okay. And it speaks to a little bit of those issues that Monique Bégin used to work on, the social determinants of health.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's the same thing.
Exactly.
These are the things that just exacerbate any of the problems that we have, the barriers, the challenges that we face. It really.
And all of those things, if we look at race, we look at poverty, we look at disability, women are always at the bottom of those achievement ladders, So yes, disability and race cause a lot of barriers for anybody who's dealing with them. But if you're a woman, there's an added challenge because it's that intersection of those identities that causes trouble.
I used to think it's because I was young, and it took me a long time to realize it was because I was a woman. Mm-hmm. And in the background, just a little bit about your private life. In the background, you were married, and this is something that Isabel really wanted me to ask. You were married, you had 3 children, and then came Jane, and a great love. The love affair, and that would have changed your whole dynamic in your private life and your work life. And you've been married for over 20 years.
Yeah. So Jane and I actually met when we were 19. We met at Queen's. So Jane was my best friend for years. And when Phil and I were married, Jane was at the wedding, and she and her partner then, Gail, were close friends of ours. So it was a gradual process of me figuring out who I was, but it changed everything. And coming out was, if I hadn't come out, I never would have been Premier. I probably would never have even gone into politics. It was.
That's interesting.
It was claiming part of myself that I'd not acknowledged or not known, and.
But it must have been really wonderful when you did. It must have been just like a whole.
It was.
Lifted from your shoulders and just.
Well, there was a clarity about it. It's like, oh, okay, this is why I've felt on the outside. This is what's been going on. But it was hard, Debra. I mean, we lived in North Toronto in a very straight, waspy enclave, I mean, it was almost like the high school that my kids went to was the same as the high school I'd gone to in the 1960s. Really, it hadn't moved along. The community was not that diverse, and certainly not diverse in terms of sexuality. And in fact, there were people in the party who when I wanted to run for a nomination in 2002, who said, maybe if you lived in Riverdale, it would be better. If you lived where there are more lesbians. I mean, it was ridiculous. Anyway, but it was, personally, it was wonderful. I mean, it was the most important juncture of my adult life. It was hard on my kids, because I came out and their dad and I separated at the same time. But we kept the family together. I mean, we had quite an alternative family. Phil lived sort of on the property. I mean, we had we were able, because we were affluent enough, we were able to keep everybody together in houses that were very close to each other, and that was great. But I had friends who crossed the street and didn't want to talk to us, you know, and I was excluded. So it was really stepping over a line. And but it was totally worth it. Would I change anything? No, not a thing.
Good for you.
Yeah.
Good, because we don't, not all of us really explore that. We don't, you know, when they refer to you as the premier, it's, you know, the first woman premier, but they don't just say the first woman premier. They always
say the lesbian.
They go, the first gay woman premier of Ontario. And I'm just going,
I'll tell you, let me tell you a quick story about that. When after I lost government in 2018, when we lost that election, and I stayed in the legislature, I had a very frank conversation with one of the reporters, and I said to him, you know, why did you feel it necessary to call me the lesbian? You know, why was that word? I'm not worried about it. I'm proud of who I am, but why? You don't say the heterosexual premier now, you know? And he said, well, we have talked about this in our story meetings, and he said, we thought that where we came to was, you know, you being a lesbian might color the way you see the world, or, you know, influence your decisions. And I said, you know, so being a straight white man doesn't color and doesn't influence your decisions? I mean, it was nuts, just a nutty, but it was honest. That's how they saw it. Like, this was because I was a departure from the dominant norm, then somehow that had to be flagged for people.
But though, with those kinds of stereotyping always existed with women. So when, you know, they describe women politicians, and they'll describe her age-ish, they'll describe what she's wearing. They'll do lots of different things where they don't talk about a man's.
I think they're more careful about that now with women.
Well, now because there are some
more
laws
conscious.
now.
Yeah, exactly.
There's some laws.
Exactly.
On the other hand, and I still hated it when they said, "Oh, the lesbian premier," because I kept saying, "None of our business." But on the other hand, the flip side of that is you would have probably encouraged or been that role model for a lot of young women
and men.
And men.
I had a lot of young people come to me. One of the most poignant moments was during the Pan Am Games in 2015. A young woman came to me and said that she had, the day I won the leadership in 2013, she had come out to her parents because she figured if the premier was a lesbian, she could safely tell her parents. So there were stories like that over and over again. So we made a decision in our family early on. You know, I first ran for school trustee in 1994. I wasn't an MPP till 2003. So we made a decision very early that I was going to be who I was. It was going to be honest and open, and the kids knew that. Because it was really the kids I wasn't worried about myself. Yeah. What are they going to do to me? I was worried about the kids. Yeah. And they were all on side with it. It was hard though for them sometimes, you know.
Well, I imagine because
they got bullied. They got bullied.
Kids can be
for
very
sure.
Cruel.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I'm sure they're fabulous. They're daughters, aren't they?
2 daughters and a son. They're the best.
Yeah. Mine are the best.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
And you're close now, so.
Yes.
Yeah, you're
absolutely.
close now. But you would have been an inspiration. I was there that day that you were elected leader of the.
In the convention.
Yeah, and it was pretty remarkable. It was exciting because of who you were, and it was dramatic.
Yeah.
But it was wow, and the conversation was, well, would the Ontario voters
right
accept her?
For sure. I had people in the party say to me, don't run for the leadership because you can't be the premier and you can't win an election. But we did. We did.
I never doubted you. I never doubted the public that wouldn't use that as an excuse not to vote for you.
It was about our faith in the people of Ontario, right? Yeah. Yeah. And I had that faith. I said that in my speech.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I remember that. That's a good speech. When I look at the trajectory of your career, you know, the change agent, activist, parent, social justice, your church, Citizens for Democracy.
Citizens for Local Democracy, yeah.
When they tried to amalgamate Toronto, and you were on the no side.
Yeah.
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 School board. I know from my brother, I know a lot about the school board work, so that would have been a legislator. It's different. It's a different path from a lot of the previous premiers. So how did all of that pathway help inform your role or your job or your time as a premier?
Well, it made me very eager and impatient to get a lot done, you know, to pick up where Dalton had left off and to try to push forward. I came into office when we'd been in government for a long time, so that was a challenge, but there were things I wanted to do, you know. In our first budget, we invested in increasing salaries for some of the women who were the worst paid in the province, you know, who worked in the disability sector and in early childhood education and personal support workers. I was really eager to move on poverty reduction, and that's why, I mean, we waited until late in the mandate because we were recovering from the economic downturn, but I wanted the minimum wage to go up. I wanted to try a basic income, you know, I wanted to put a pilot in place. So those things were really important to me, and I wanted to continue the improvements in education and health. So it made me really impatient and want to do that. But the other thing it did, that background, that person who I was, I really felt a very strong obligation to listen to people on the outside of government, because I hadn't grown up in the party. You know, I had not been an organizer early on. I had always been outside of the partisan process, and I wanted to make sure that we listened to people on the ground doing the work that we were trying to influence. And sometimes that meant that I had to get out of my car and talk to protesters, you know, and say to my detail, it's okay, I'm going to talk to these people. Or for example, when the Black Lives Matter, I think it was in 16, maybe 2016 anyway, they were camped outside the chief, well, they were outside the chief of police, the police station, and then moved up to Queen's Park. And I said to my staff, I'm going to go out and I'm going to have a conversation with these young people, because most of them were young, a lot of them were young women, and they were really angry because the chief of police hadn't come out to speak to them, the mayor hadn't spoken to them, and I felt strongly that I wanted to go. I wasn't afraid, you know, and I think that activist background made me not afraid of conflict. The other thing was, I had worked for a decade as a mediator. I'd worked as a community mediator. I had worked around the province in schools, teaching kids about conflict resolution and training teachers. And so conflict was something, that I understood from my background, because I'd been a difficult human being and I'd created a lot of conflict, but I'd tried to deal with that by understanding how conflict worked. So I wasn't afraid of conflict, and I think that prepared me well for political life.
It's also interesting because it was all, you know, a lot of men come into political life from a corporate world, or there's a corporate background, or else they come in very early into politics.
Right.
You know, they were assistants on the Hill, and then they decide to be a member of Parliament, and you know, there's more or less those two.
Or municipal. Sometimes they're municipal.
But it's all still all politics.
All politics. Yes, politics. Exactly.
So it's either the economy, commerce, politics, law. So they would have a really different view and perspective on the world. Yeah. If women are coming through social movements.
Exactly.
The feminist movement, social movements, reform in education, reform in health, mediation. Yeah. Mediation typically is not, I would assume, this is an assumption, there are more women mediators than men mediators.
Certainly in the community mediation world that I lived in. I think in some of the corporate stuff, there are men, because there's more money. There's money to be made, right? But yes, that's true. I did my training through some of the Mennonite community work, and so yeah, I had a very different background than most of the people who were my colleagues. Certainly my male colleagues, for sure.
That would be really exciting. That would be really exciting for women to understand, know, and for young women, you know, you're the role model. Well, so it's not you looking the role, you're the role model.
Well, and you know, I think we really need to draw on a whole diversity of backgrounds. I mean, we're lucky in Ontario. We have farmers who are part of the legislature. We have small business owners, but they've traditionally been men. And when we were elected in 2003, we had a woman who was a farmer, and that kind of diversity, because again, it's the intersection of all those identities that makes for good policy, in my opinion.
Working with working on the Women's History Project and doing some of the research and trying to find women that I want to talk to or find subjects that we should be discussing at events. And I'm learning things about, the women's role in the union movement. You always think unions are, male dominated, and they are, but there is a very strong feminist movement within the union movement. Or when you take a look at some of the temperist and the early, the right to vote,
Suffragette, yeah.
A lot of them came from the farm movement.
Yes.
So it was the farmers unions.
Yes.
So you
because they had stature.
So you take a look at some of the history, and you're going, there's some pretty interesting people, interesting women out there from all walks of life.
Well, but even, Debra, I think that is absolutely true. It's so important to look at the roles that those women played. And even when you look, and I had this experience of being in PEI, and we kind of recreated, when I was premier with the other premiers, we recreated the picture of the fathers of Confederation, right? And there were some mothers of Confederation. But, I said to my colleagues at the time, like, each one of those men had a woman behind him making his life work, supporting him, feeding him, ironing his clothes, and honest to goodness, if we don't start valuing that work, because we still don't. We don't look for, on a resume, we don't ask young women to put down the work that they have done. Maybe they've taken some time out to look after children. We don't value that work in any way. It is invisible. We want it to stay that way. We say, take a mat leave and do what you need to do. Men think it's a break, often, and then come back to work. And that is not at all the reality of what a woman does when she has a child.
Which is interesting now, because, it used to be maternity leave. And maternity leave, and I was talking to somebody the other day about early childhood education and care. And it used to be a women's issue. It was a feminist issue. It is now a parenting issue.
Yes.
I've got colleagues who've gone on parental leave.
Yes.
And they are now the house husband.
Yeah.
My son-in-law spends most of the time taking care of the children. He's at university. My daughter's the one that's going out to work. But that value of having somebody at home taking care of the children, it doesn't necessarily anymore have to be the woman.
It doesn't. But that work is still not valued the way it should be, no matter who's doing it. Because yes, there are men who are doing that work, still not many. I mean, to be fair. And even if they are, that work is not valued. It's seen as, a step outside the real world into this, haze of child rearing, and then they step back into the real world. So that's the challenge I'm talking about. When does all the work that creates a strong community get valued? When we were doing the basic income pilot in Ontario, one of the things that I was really interested in, had we been able to complete it, unfortunately Doug Ford canceled it, but had we been able to get the evidence, would have been from artists and people who were working at other things in the community that they couldn't afford to do without some support, right?
Yep.
And there had been evidence from the 70s in the Manitoba Mincome Project that if everybody had a living wage in a community, the whole community was better, That doesn't mean everybody had a 9-to-5 job. Sometimes it meant people quit their job and went back to school and then went back to work, or stayed home with their children and were able to do that and then go back into the working world. So I think that we have a very narrow view of what valuable work is, and that has not changed in to the degree I thought it would have over my 71 years.
The issue that was described to me the other day was there are women's issues, there are feminist issues, but nobody really took a look at the feminist issues in the context of economic, the whole kind of economic system, the whole kind of commerce, because it wasn't valued. The work that women do wasn't valued. It was either volunteer work at the hospital or this. So if you wanted to restructure a community, you really have to take a look at the economic value of that community and how you...
Well, you have to reframe the way you talk about the economy.
Yeah.
I mean, what's the economy?
Yep.
Right? And I would say this to my staff. When we talk about the economy, we're talking about the whole economy. We're talking about all the work that goes in to making our society work, which is why it's so interesting in Iceland when the women go on strike. It's like, we're just withdrawing our services, all our services. And then what happens? Things fall apart, And so I just think we have to think differently about, because the economy is seen as hard numbers, it's seen as balance sheets and GDP and all of those good measures. I'm not saying that they're a problem, but they don't always take into account all the work that supports the work of those people who make that wealth.
You've worked on a variety of causes and important social changes throughout your political career. What did you find the most challenging to implement, or the one that you're the most proud of, or both?
Well, I have to say, being the Minister of Education was the dream job for me, because I had, I'd been in education. My career was in education. The work I had done before I got into politics was all in the realm of education. So to be the Minister of Education and to be involved when we were implementing full-day kindergarten, for example, it was really a dream. It was wonderful to have that opportunity, and smaller things like putting equity, the notion of equity, back into the way we valued the success of students, or the way we measured the success of students and the well-being in a school. So those were things that were real highlights of my career, because as you know, under the previous Conservative government under Harris, equity had been taken out of. The whole notion of equity had been taken out of the implementation of policies in the school and the measurement of success. So that felt like really important work. Also, being in positions where I could advance the stature and knowledge of Indigenous people and change the way we teach our history. I'm really proud of that work. It's not work that gets, it doesn't get celebrated a lot, but it will change the way people in this province see our history, and it already is. I mean, kids, I teach a course at U of T, and I have first year students in September, and those young people have a different knowledge of the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people than I did and than my kids did. So those are changes that I think will make a huge difference.
And you also did some changes with sex education.
Sex education, yeah.
I mean,
the sex education curriculum was being reviewed in the course of curriculum review, and we brought in a new curriculum in 2010, and the world blew up, because homophobes like Charles McVitie decided that they were going to make an issue of it. And it took us 5 years, because Dalton withdrew that curriculum, and we went into a process of consultation. Well, we had an election, and then he stepped down, and then I became leader. And so it wasn't until 2015 when we brought the new curriculum in, which was much like the former curriculum. There were some changes and a few updates, but it was the one that we brought in 2010. And it was important because, there'd been no internet in 1998 when there'd been no fear of kids getting information online at that point, and all of that was the case in 2010. Kids had access to just a ton of information, and they need help sorting it through. So, yeah, I mean, I'm proud of that. I was not proud of the way it was received. It made me very upset that there was that kind of pushback from a small but vocal minority, because it was a minority. And then it really bothered me that it became a political football, you know. So Doug Ford actually ran on repealing the sex ed curriculum, even though he ended up putting exactly the same curriculum back in place because it was based on evidence, right?
Yeah, it was times.
Yeah.
It was, you can't go back.
Yeah, exactly.
You can't go back. And going back, those days weren't all good.
No, No, the rose-colored glasses in terms of the
good.
past,
No,
ridiculous.
There's a lot of things that weren't discussed.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of things in it. And of course now with social media, you know, it's, you know, you'd probably see a change from the beginning of your career when you
For sure.
you know, in education to now, and, you know, youth, you know, mental health issues.
For sure. Well, and that has all been exacerbated by COVID, right? We're in a tough moment, I think, in terms of the education system, because the COVID really set us back, and it it created a disengagement that I think is dangerous. I mean, social media and technology has done that anyway, but when we went through this couple of years where we said you have to depend on you have to depend on these devices to actually engage with your school, it was very harmful. And teachers will tell you we're not recovered yet.
But it's just like everybody in society withdrew.
Yeah.
I mean, it was.
But if you withdraw for most of your high school years, or from the time you're in grade 4 until you're in grade 8, those are pretty formative years, you know, and it's hard to get back that socialization time and develop those skills. I mean, kids will do it; they're resilient, but it's not nothing, you know. And the reason I say we're in a hard moment is that schools are not getting the support they need. The boards are not getting the support they need to have the staff to do that work. So I'm very worried about it. I hear from teachers and educators all the time that things are not great.
Be still coming to you for stuff.
I talk to a lot. Yeah, people do.
They want to talk.
They want to talk. They want to chat. Yeah,
which must give you a little bit of energy and to say, you know, I was on the right track. I was doing the right thing.
We were. Yeah. It was a good. I mean, it wasn't perfect. It's never perfect, but yeah.
Yeah, but it's the art of the possible. It's what you can do and what you can get away with. What obstacles do you see as the most significant for Canadian society in achieving equality, not just for women, but for, you know, across all the intersections?
I think we're going backwards. I'm really worried about us going backwards. I think there's a new permission. I think when Donald Trump was elected, I mean, he was kind of a symptom of a populist movement that, in some ways, we're part of. I mean, we may be a paler version of that, but I think we have some of the same characteristics in our politics right now. So the divisions, the oversimplification of issues, the lack of support for media that will spend the time to figure out what's actually going on and report on what's going on. It's a huge problem.
Journalists think it's a huge problem when they, you know, Bell Media cuts all those international jobs, and the only one left standing is Joy Malbon, and she's only there because of Donald Trump.
Yeah, so
you have young people who don't have the context, don't have the history.
Well, and you can see right now what's going on with the divisions around what's happening in the Middle East. I mean, it's terrifying the degree to which there's no civil discourse that is able to bridge. And I'm not speaking on one side or the other. I'm just saying we've got to talk about this, and we've got to, certainly in Canada, we've got to find a way to not vilify each other if we're going to continue to build this country.
So I was talking again a couple of days ago about safe spaces and how the tendency now in most work environments is to make sure that we have a safe space. And a lot of that is interpreted as we can't discuss issues. We've just got to behave, and people are so sensitive, and you can't say things.
Yeah. So, and that's not what a safe space is.
That's not what a safe space is.
No, exactly.
So we've got to start talking about a safe space where you can have debates and conversations and disagreements and try to work out what the issues are and the best approach. So safe space doesn't mean you shut down and you can't say things.
Exactly. Well, I just made a speech recently with a group of adult learners, and I was talking about the state of federalism, and I was saying that one of the things that is sorely needed is serious conversation about the big issues that are tearing us apart. So the fact of Alberta's economy and the reliance on oil and gas, it is a fact. And so if we reduce that fact and the conflict it causes with the federal government, if we reduce that to a political argument about, the federal government pricing carbon too high and therefore the Alberta economy suffers, and we don't get at the reality that we have to deal with climate change. We have a responsibility to deal with climate change, and we have a responsibility to the people of Alberta as a country to make sure that as their economy has to evolve, there is support for them. But we're not having that conversation. We're just watching Danielle Smith and Scott Moe in Saskatchewan fight with Justin Trudeau as though this is strictly a political issue, and there's no ramification or implication to just having a political fight. There's huge implications. I mean, the fact is industry is moving towards zero emissions. If we don't have a conversation about how to go there, then we're going to suffer, and people in Alberta particularly will suffer. Right?
And there is the view that the whole kind of environmental movement actually now really understands the environment and the economy and the relationship, and it is now an economic conversation about the environment, and you can have alternatives rather than just.
But the politicians are stuck in this ping pong game of you're right and I'm wrong. So I think that is a huge impediment. And and all that entails, the increase in permission for misogyny, for racism, for division and polarization, all of that feeds into real problems, I think, for us as a nation, because we already have challenges with our geography. We're huge geography with different regional language bases, and so. To have yet another layer of issues that will divide us, that's a huge problem.
And it is getting ugly.
It is, it is not where we would want it to be in terms of finding consensus and continuing to build this beautiful place.
Yeah, no, that's very true. The next year is going to be really, it's going to be a difficult year. So before I have a couple of questions to conclude, but are there things around the history of women or the feminist movement, things that you would like to say to us, or you would like to say to other people? If you had to do it all over again, would you do it?
Absolutely.
Would you do it differently?
I might start earlier, a little bit earlier in politics. I wasn't elected as an MPP till I was 50. I was 47 when I was elected as a school trustee, and I think that I held myself back a bit. I didn't dream big enough. When I ran for school board in 1994, I thought I'm going to stay at the school board level. And, if Mike Harris had never been elected in Ontario, I never would have been premier. I mean, I'm sure he's glad to know that he helped me be the premier. He made me. But I wouldn't have, because I wouldn't have thought I was up to it. And I hope that young women know that they are up to it, that they are good enough, that they can do the things that they want to do, that they don't have to let somebody else do it. I mean, in my own life, the silly example was in grade 13, I didn't run for school president, I ran for secretary, because honestly, I just thought, I won't get elected, and I didn't want to get rejected. And if I had that to do again, I would absolutely run for school president.
Yeah, I was content just doing their posters. I was in high school, actually. I ran the campaign for the guy that ran for president.
Well, there you go. You see,
stupid me. But that's true.
I mean, somebody has to run the campaigns, and that's not, that work is important, and I'm not diminishing that in any way. Somebody has to be the secretary, absolutely. But I just think if we could get to the point where people can do the things they want to do and not be held back by artificial perceptions, that just because there hadn't been a girl as the president before, you couldn't do it,
Fear to succeed.
Yeah, the fear of success.
The fear of success. But that's an interesting point you make because, young women are active in the feminist movement, in the environmental movement, in the Me Too movement, in whatever the movements are, they're successful. They're, they've got the brash and the intellect and they're vocal. But how do you get them involved in politics? Because it's in politics that you're going to actually
Well, let's just stay, yes, that's true, but let's just stay with women in all those other sectors because one of the things that I'm trying to do right now is I'm trying to tap into a group of millennial women and work with some of my colleagues of my generation and kind of bring together a conversation because I don't know if you saw the articles, they come out every year around International Women's Day about, the number of women who are leaving professions, yes. Right? Millennial women who are, now it's millennial women who are leaving because of sexual harassment, because of the what they have to sacrifice in order to climb that ladder, and I just think that we better be serious about what those constraints are and what those structures are that haven't changed enough for those young women, because honest to goodness, when you and I were kids, we didn't think that was going to be an issue when our kids and our grandkids were raising kids and trying to work and fulfill their own aspirations at the same time. So
I would never have thought about misogyny. No. I wouldn't even know the word misogyny. I wouldn't have known that. But to think that, one of the cabinet ministers in Ottawa, had the front of her office defaced.
Yeah, so I think it was Catherine McKenna.
Yeah, Catherine McKenna.
Yeah.
And, but that goes on all the time, and women politicians are frightened, and now they're talking about, more protection,
more security.
More security, and you're going, like, why? When did this get out of control? Like,
and the whole...
You want those women in those...
Absolutely.
In those places.
Absolutely, and the whole realm of politics has become more toxic, but then for women it has this sexual overtone, this kind of violence and sexualized overtone.
Throwback to another
exactly era. But it's with us, and that's why we need to have these conversations. We need to shine a light on it, and we need to say it is not good enough. It just is not good enough, because we've fought our whole lives to make a world where young women can feel that they have the same shot as young men. And that's what publicly funded education is about. That's what so many of the policies that have been put in place by our governments over the years. And it hasn't borne the fruit that we hoped. And in fact, because of what's going on right now in terms of polarization and this rise of this populist, angry attitude, we're going backwards. So we have a lot of work to do still. Sorry to say, but we do.
But that's why we're having conversations like this.
Exactly.
That's why we want to understand the history.
Yeah.
That's why we want to sort of mobilize, inspire, motivate women to take to the streets again if they have to, and
Yeah, and I think the other thing, and I say this to groups of young women now, I can't promise you, and this goes to your point about would you do it again, I can't promise you that things are going to change that much in the next decade, I can't promise you that. We don't know. But they certainly won't change if you don't get involved, you know? And so getting involved is so important, and there's so much good you can do, and the world will look different if you are involved than if you're not. So that is so important.
I feel a campaign coming on. Anything else that we want to talk about? Is there anything that we sort of overlooked that we never even talked about your nomination? That must have been tough because nominations are always tough.
They're good learning experiences, though. Really good, figuring out, okay, this is how this works.
Now, I was in the UK for most of the Dalton McGuinty years, but I knew Dalton when he was a lawyer in Ottawa, and we were raising money for David Peterson.
Right.
So, and I have to make calls, and he didn't like that very much. So I was away for most of those years.
Right.
But so there's many political people in Ontario I don't know as well as I should, perhaps. But the whole kind of feminist thing there's still that thread through
well, you know,
whatever regime or whatever,
absolutely.
whatever parliament, whatever legislature.
In 2003, and this is probably a good story to end on, in 2003, we were elected, and our government, we had 70 plus members, and we decided within Dalton's government that we were going to create a women's caucus. And men were welcome to come. A couple of men did come, but it was a women's caucus. And we talked about different things than we talked about in caucus. And one of the things we talked about was poverty reduction. We had not run on a platform that had a specific policy on poverty reduction. Yes, education, yes, healthcare, and all of those things are determinants of health and so on. But we, as a women's caucus, we brought an argument to the larger caucus that we needed to have a poverty reduction strategy. And because of the women in the Liberal government between 2003 and 2018, when I lost government, there is a poverty reduction strategy in Ontario. The child benefit that we put in place was put in place because of our poverty reduction strategy. So it's very, very clear to me from my lived experience that it is critical that women be at the table. You know, it is absolutely critical, because we can call them women's issues, but they are human issues that affect every single person in our society. And if we don't get them right, if we don't get early education right, if we don't get health care right, if we don't get care of seniors right, that affects everybody in the society. So that's why
and that's where women come, because that's the perspective they bring to
exactly
the table. That's what they bring
that's
to
the
the
work
table.
they've done. Yeah,
And that's what the work that they have to continue to do.
exactly.
This has been wonderful.
Thank you.
I'm really excited about this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Debra.
Do something.
Thank you very much for doing this. It's great.
I'm Debra Davis, President and co-founder of the Women's History Project. This has been the Women's History Project production, with thanks to our sponsors, partners, and special guests. Please like us, follow us, subscribe, and share. You can find out more about our first season of 1,000 Voices, 1,000 Stories on our website, www.womenshistoryproject.ca.